Hi everybody, and welcome to our webinar on air today, run by Future Earth, on how to write a science blog post that people want to read. This is the first of Future Earth's pop-up communication webinar series, and it aims to give researchers communication skills and tools to engage with a wider audience. We'll be running a bunch of different webinars over the coming months on topics like visualization, mapping tools, writing op-eds, and scientific commentaries. So I encourage you to sign up at futureearth.org or by following us on Twitter at futureearth, or one word. If you wanted to tweet about tonight's webinar, please use the hashtag #popupwebinars. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You should be able to see a chat function. There'll be points where I'll ask you to share your thoughts, and if you have any questions as we go along through today's webinar, please write them here, and my colleague Owen will collect those questions and we'll have some time to address them at the end of the webinar. There's a lot of information that I'll be providing over the next sort of 45 minutes and a lot of links. We'll be posting the slides on SlideShare afterwards, and we'll send you a link to that by email so you can peruse them at your leisure. We'll also be sending you a survey at the end of this webinar. We would love if you could take a couple of minutes to give your feedback and help us improve the webinar series for future. All right, without further ado, let's get kick-started. So I wanted to start with a bit of an introduction to who I am. My name's Michelle Kovacevic, and I've been helping scientists across the world tell their research stories since 2005. I like to describe myself, I suppose, in 4 different parts. The first part of my professional background is a scientist, actually. I studied neuroscience and then spent some time in Indonesia working at the Centre for International Forestry Research, where I was their blog coordinator and social media coordinator as well. In the top right-hand corner, you'll see the blog that C4 launched called Forest News. And I'll be drawing on a lot of learnings that I developed over those 3 years, setting up this blogging platform and working with scientists to populate that blogging platform. On the bottom left corner is a photo from a communications training that I've run with scientists. So I do a lot of communications training and particularly blogging communications with scientists, again, informing a lot of the work that I'm going to be presenting to you tonight. And lastly, another project that I work on is helping early career researchers and young professionals in forestry and agriculture participate in conferences. So in the next 45 minutes, what are we going to cover? We're going to start off talking about what can blogging do for science and why it's important to blog about science. Even if you are a seasoned communications professional and you are you do sort of have an idea of why science is good for blogging, it's always good to have a bit of a refresher. And hopefully the content I present to you will help you make a good business case if you're trying to set up a blog in your institute. If you're a scientist, hopefully what I'm presenting will convince you that blogging is worth the time investment. We'll then move into audience and storytelling, which really underpins a lot of the blogging sort of finer tips and tricks, which I'll talk about in part 3, which is structure, and I'm borrowing a lot of stuff from journalists there. And then lastly, we'll finish up with some do's and don'ts. There's a key resource that I'm drawing on today, and there's editorial guidelines we developed at C4 for our blog and for scientists writing for our blog and communications people writing for our blog. I've included a link here. It's a really fabulous resource, and I think you'll find it really interesting to have a look at after the webinar. I want to start off by setting the scene with a really fabulous quote by Sir Paul Callaghan, who is a physicist from New Zealand. And he talks about storytelling in science. And what I love about this, and I think this sets us up well when we're talking about blogging and talking about stories in science, is that science has a valor and a beauty and provides a very human window into the world. And telling those stories of science simply and clearly is how we connect science with humanity. And I think that really underpins kind of the philosophy of blogging about science. So what is a blog, first of all? It's a collection of short, informal, sometimes controversial, and sometimes deeply personal online posts. And the purpose of blogging is to provide a story that, and one of the purposes, I should say, is to entice a reader to download a scientific paper or read the research or publication to fully understand the science. When we look at the science blogging space, there's a huge amount of science blogs out there now. There's over 2.5 million blogs in the world, and approximately 20,000 of those are actually science blogs. There's some stats that say we have new blogs every 2 seconds starting up, and those that are written by scientists are growing every single day. But why is it important to blog about science? I think this is a really key stat. There are a whole bunch of research papers being produced right now, and only a very small proportion of them are being read and are being cited and downloaded. Blogging has the potential to widen readership of science by orders of magnitude. This graph here is some data we collected at C4 that examined the downloads of a scientific paper before and after a blog was put out about that paper. As you can see, before the blog was posted, we had reasonable downloads and reasonable readership, but as soon as a blog was posted, that readership skyrocketed, doubling or tripling. So blogging really helps to get science well read. Stories also create common ground between science and people, and a common language that enables us to connect with our audience and deliver our messages. And I think this really builds empathy and understanding between science and people. Blogging also helps to make can help you make an impact beyond academia. This is an example of a story that we published, one of our scientists published at C4 about peatlands and mangroves. And this story actually led to the scientists being invited to brief government officials. After the government officials had read that story, that scientist was invited by NGOs and universities to explore potential new research collaborations. So not only is by blogging are you getting your research out there and getting it read, you're actually having an impact in making new connections, new networks, and perhaps having your research, I guess, extended and better realized. So really, the fact is you can choose not to blog, but you can certainly expect your papers and ideas will be increasingly blogged about. So I quite like this little moniker of blog or be blogged. You can either choose to have someone represent your work for you, or you can get out there and talk about the research that you or your institute is doing and be on the front foot of that. So the question, if you've now decided that blogging is worthwhile and worthwhile investment of time, is perhaps whether you might go for an institutional blog, so a blog that's set up by an organisation, perhaps a research institute, and has their scientific staff contributing articles to that blog, which is on a picture on the left here, or perhaps a personal blog. So some scientists do set up blogs, a simple WordPress website, and post their stories on that rather than going through their institution. I wanted to quickly examine some of the pros and cons of each of those types of blogs. So an institutional blog, really the pros of choosing to blog with your institution is that the institution normally has a very broad audience, and often will have a higher readership than if you were to set up your own personal blog and try to do that on your own. You would receive normally editing assistance from communication staff within the institute, which can be really valuable in providing sort of some, some fact checking potentially, or just someone to have another look at the story that you've written before it goes online. It can also be less time consuming. You're one of 200 researchers at an institute. You won't be expected to blog every day or every week. You could write a blog every now and then and sort of use that to build your profile. Some of the cons of that is that of blogging with the institute is you may not be able to publish everything you want to write about. You may be wanting to write about some more personal topics, perhaps, or take a different angle that might be slightly controversial, and that's just not what the institutional blog has been set up for, and therefore is not something that you can do. So it may be a little bit more restrictive in that sense. So then what are the pros and cons for starting up a personal blog? A personal blog is obviously all about you. It's your blog, it's your profile, it's something you have set up. And so that means it can catapult, I guess, your profile much more sort of highly than if you're one of a couple of scientists featured on an institutional page. You can have a blog that integrates with the rest of your profile. So as you can see on the picture on the left here, this is from a conservation scientist in Australia. He's actually put his he's put his publications on his website, many media articles he's been featured in. He's got a whole bunch of things he's curated, like cartoons that he likes, some Australiana pictures that he's taken. So you can actually have a much more sort of, I guess, holistic online profile as part of your personal blog. You can blog about your science, but you can also blog about other cool stuff if you have a personal blog. So as you can see here, he's Corey, who's the scientist featured in this blog, has written something on essential papers you've probably never read. Now, whether or not he could write that for the university that he works at, and whether that would be interesting to the university, that may not be true, but he can write it on his personal blog. And you can still publish what you're writing on your personal blog on your it can be cross-published onto your institutional blog. So you could write a story, publish it on your personal blog, and just let your university or research institute know that you've written that, and they may choose to cross-publish and feature that on your blog, on their blog, sorry, which drives traffic to your personal blog. The cons of having a personal blog is that it is time-intensive. To really build an audience, you probably would want to be publishing a blog a week, perhaps a blog a fortnight you could get away with, but it is something you would need to more regularly maintain than if you were just contributing every now and then to an institutional blog. You kind of also need something to say. Obviously, you can present your latest research, but the kind of idea of a personal blog is you develop a voice of your own, and you there's certain angles on topics you take, and you have a lot of opinions on issues, and you're doing a lot of analysis. The best scientific personal blogs are those sort of very, I guess, forthcoming and personal stories. Another type of blog that you could choose to take part in is something called collaborative blogs. So basically here is, you could get together with another researcher and blog about your field together. Here's a picture of a blog called Parasite of the Day, which is two scientists who work on insects who came together and started their own blog, and they kind of share the content generation. They invite guest bloggers on as well. And that's one way to share the workload, and also, I guess, develop partnerships within your scientific field. That way you get more blog entries and you'll both be inspired by one another. The most common collaborative group blogs are those on perhaps coming from research groups and departments who maybe have a departmental page already on a website and they just add a blog to that. So you could ask everyone in that department to contribute a story to the blog each week. Or perhaps for your teaching groups, you could ask them to write about their favorite topic within your research field. You could run a competition and get people to submit blogs to that. There's various ways you could sort of set up collaborative blogs or contribute to collaborative blogs out there. Some journals like PLOS have blogs as well, and you can be invited to contribute to those. And of course, putting on here Future Earth, something that we'll be talking a bit about later, but we are looking for content from across the sustainability sphere, and so this could be sort of seen as a collaborative blog venture as well. So now that we've talked about the sort of where and how you can blog, I wanted to just spend one moment just talking about the audience. So chances are you will be wanting to reach many audiences through writing blog stories. That may be policymakers, general public, potential future students for your institute or at your academic in your academic field, potential collaborators, etc. And how can you write for those very various, quite different audiences? One way I've seen a lot of science blogs sort of pitch their audience or think about their audience as this sort of intelligent non-expert, and could sometimes be called, an undergraduate student, someone who is familiar with basic scientific concepts, but not with the intricacies of whatever subject you happen to be writing about. And I think approaching it in this way, thinking of that kind of fictitious individual who, is educated but not sort of super technical, means that if you write clearly and explain your research's relevance, then it's likely to be interesting and understandable to most of the audiences you want to reach. Obviously, if you've got something that's very policy specific, you may choose for that particular piece of research to write it in a way that's more geared at policymakers. But generally speaking, writing in plain English and writing clearly and concisely allows you to target a very broad range of people. Now, if you're obviously wanting to write for scientists, for experts in your field, they might be annoyed that you haven't included nitty-gritty technical details if you're targeting that kind of audience. But the whole point of blogging is that you're pointing them to the research. So if they want that level of detail, they can always read the research paper, and they could have a discussion with you about that afterwards, or perhaps you could, tweet about it and have a conversation on Twitter. So the audience of the blog is really, it shouldn't be well, unless you're developing a more technical, a technical aspect of your research paper, it really should not be aimed at a super technical audience, and be aimed at a much more broad audience. A good thing here to keep in mind as well is to know why your audience cares about what you're writing about. And this is something I'll come to in a bit, but that why question, why does this matter? Why is it important for me, is crucial when writing a blog story that's going to resonate with people. So having an understanding of why a policymaker, or why a potential student, or why someone from the general public cares about or thinks that science is important is really important. Another thing to keep in mind is your audience will evolve over time. So you need to be on your toes and maybe adjust your writing over time as your audience potentially grows. And you may wish to challenge your audience at times, presenting materials that are outside potentially their core area of interest. So there are opportunities where you can present something a bit more technical, as long as you kind of, maybe flag that in the story with your audience. And we'll talk a bit more later about how to reach those audiences. So coming now into the side of, what's your story really? What is it that, now you want to blog, and you kind of have figured out what kind of audience you're looking for? What do you write about? I think generally speaking, it's important you write about something you care about. If you blog about something you're not really that interesting, your blog will reflect that lack of interest when people read it. So when you're preparing to blog about something, I would be asking myself, what do you want to talk about on your blog? How can you have a unique voice in the maelstrom of noise on the internet and in the blogging world? And that should help you start getting the ball rolling. When it comes to science, there are a couple of types of science stories that you could sort of look to. The most common one is published research covered in a more newsy style. So this is where it's in a similar way to, the way a newspaper or the media would cover it. It's very short, it's snappy, it's sharp. It tells us what the research finding was, why it's important, gives us a bit of context, maybe has a couple of quotes from the key scientists who published that paper, and then ties it up. There's also analysis of published research, and this is typically written by the lead scientist of that paper. So perhaps a new paper you and your colleagues or your peers have published, rather than just reporting the findings, in an analysis piece, you could discuss why the findings are important and the significance they carry, how they advance knowledge in the research field, how this new knowledge can change policy, for example, or you could choose to focus on a very specific part of the research finding. So for example, the previous example I used, let me just show you, this was a news story saying that, research had found nearly a quarter of some fires in Indonesia occurred in oil palm plantations. Now the scientists then chose to do a bit of an analysis of that research finding, and look specifically at the data collection method using satellite imagery. And they wanted to really discuss and present a message to policymakers that satellite data can be, needs to be considered with certain sort of ideas in mind. So, and those analysis pieces can be, if timed well. So for example, this was all released when the haze crisis was happening in Southeast Asia. There was a lot of interest around that story. So if timed well, those news and analysis pieces can be incredibly powerful, and reach the audience that you're trying to target. You could also choose to comment on the latest developments. So this is kind of relating again to the analysis of news findings. You may not have a specific piece of research that's come out that you could draw to, but you may be working in a certain area, and there happens to be a development in the media or in society that relates to that research area. So an example I've given here is in 2013, you may have heard Sheryl Sandberg released a book called Lean In, encouraging women to lean into their careers more. And this researcher worked with rural women in gender, and she wanted to reflect on that that book that was really popular as to the implications of that for women in rural forest areas where she worked. And this can be, again, a great way to profile science in context. Instead of just kind of willy-nilly choosing a time to write about research, really connecting it to something that's happening in the world at that time that people are interested in. There may not even be a development, but you may just choose you want to write about something that's that's happening that you're interested in. Another thing that is very a great science story, and we'll come back more to the human stories, is these human stories from the field, from the lab. I don't think in science we do this enough. Scientists are out in the field working with people all the time. People are in the lab doing really interesting sort of science. And there's so many stories that could be there. They may not be research findings. They may be about the process, or they may be about the stories of the people. And they can be incredibly powerful ways to get people interested in science. Here's an example of a story that was produced out of the Congo. One of our communications people at C4 went out and met with, so this was a bunch of research being done on bushmeat, trying to figure out, how much bushmeat was being consumed in the Congo. And she interviewed a bunch of different actors in the Congo Basin who were hunting bushmeat. There was a hunter, there was a scientist, there was a couple of others. And she told their stories, and she put the research in the context of their stories, and it was an incredibly powerful way to profile the research. So think about that. Think about the human stories that are inherent in the science that's being conducted. Conferences are a great place to find science stories. They can be blogs on a particular session that you perhaps attended, and you want to offer sort of perhaps a more newsy style of story that presents the main findings that the researchers presented. Or you perhaps want to add your own take on something that scientists have been talking about at a conference. Or you may choose to do a bigger story where you reflect on the kind of the relevance of that meeting in the global context, for example. Or you could do a mixture of all those things in one story. Here's an example of a scientist who went to a conference in Myanmar and used that as an opportunity to reflect on sort of Myanmar's democratic process and where it was headed in terms of its economy. And you can see here, and this is something you can read, I guess, after the webinar, how he sets up this story about with his own personal, his own travel to the venue of the conference, and how he felt, the smells he heard, the sounds he heard coming into Myanmar for the first time. Very powerful way to engage your readers in sort of your journey and your thoughts on the issue. And then there's a whole bunch of other ways you could find stories. I just wanted to show you, this is again from Corey Bradshaw, the conservation scientist. He's got a whole bunch of different tips that he writes about on his blog that are relevant for students or for scientists themselves, that he offers as, a service to the scientific community. That can be really interesting content, reflections on, how it is being a PhD student, what you're learning, or the trials and tribulations of that. They can be really interesting stories and sort of draw people in to want to know more about the science that you're doing. Oh, and the other thing I was going to ask here, point out here, that if your readers ask you a question, for example, on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, which I'll talk about later as a way to disseminate your blog stories, but if you're publishing in stories and you've got comments on those blog stories, or you're on Twitter and people are sort of commenting on your stories, in those comments and those discussions often can generate really interesting sort of stories. So that maybe that someone's asked you a question about a particular part of a blog you've written, that, a blog centered on that question, sort of, I guess, generated by your audience almost, can make it really interesting stories and really relevant stories to what people are asking. So monitoring the conversations happening online in the space that you're working can be a really great way to find good sort of stories. So the question then comes to, what about unpublished research? This is probably mostly relevant at a conference, or also, I guess, as if you're a scientist and you want to write about something that you haven't published yet. Now, I mean, we at C4 always try to write about published research where and as much as possible. Obviously, if research hasn't been through peer review and it changes after that process, it can be a bit tricky. how you kind of navigate that space. However, obviously there can be really interesting preliminary findings that are very relevant to global conversations that you may wish to profile before they've been published. That's a call you have to make, I guess, depending on that research, if it's your own. And I would say in the blog, it's important to make it clear whether it has been published or not. For example, if it hasn't, you could say in forthcoming research, we've found blah, blah, blah. And making sure to contextualize that research, pointing out where it sits in relation to similar work. If it is someone else's research you want to write about that hasn't been published, for example, you're hearing it at the conference being presented, always best to check with the presenter as to whether they're okay about you writing about their research. In most cases, people are fine with that, as long as you're not obviously publishing their data. And you're perhaps writing about sort of more generally what they were speaking about. That's normally fine. But if in doubt, ask the presenter. But generally speaking, with unpublished research, just be careful about that one. All right, we're now moving into some of the more, I guess, structural and specific elements of how you write a story. I'm going to be sort of using some terminology over the coming few slides that are maybe quite familiar to you if you're a comms person. But for scientists, this is language that they're not necessarily always that exposed to. So the first thing that I think is important to focus on is the angle or the focus of the article. What I mean by that is there's various ways you can choose to write any story. A simple example here, new iPhone has been released. You could write your story around how this product is better than its predecessor. You could talk about the market and how this might change the market. You could talk about how what users of the new phone think of it. You could apply these types of questions to any, I guess, research finding. So thinking about, I guess, what makes the most interesting story, or perhaps writing a series of stories that explore those different parts of the research could be, is an important first place to start when you're thinking about the kind of story you want to write. There's various different structures for stories. I'm going to talk about a few journalistic structures in a moment, but when we think about stories, any kind of story, and what makes stories really resonate with people, this is a really useful structure to think of. So all stories have some kind of, this is how it is, how it was. There's an initial equilibrium, everything's fine. There's a disruption, an event happens that disrupts the equilibrium. You recognize that there's been a disruption, you repair that disruption, and you reinstate the equilibrium. This is like every Grimm brothers tale, there's a hero that, goes on a quest, there's a challenge they have to find, and then everything's kind of resolved in the end. With science, I think we can kind of, find similar ways that has been presented, that kind of correlates with storytelling. And this is something being developed by Elizabeth Connor from the Kinship, who's a fantastic science communicator in New Zealand. I've linked to her website here. So with science, we have an initial state of knowledge. The research reveals new information. There's an inconsistency recognized, an attempt to find new knowledge, and then there's a new state of knowledge. So that's a scientific process, and that's a storytelling process. Now, it may not be that you write the story in that specific way, but all the elements that I've just listed here should be somehow incorporated into your story to make it sort of, I guess, a gripping tale. This is kind of similar to, and now I want to move into some more journalistic structures, how journalists may write news. Just going back here, the last part of the story is the new state of knowledge. And this is kind of, I guess, the new research finding, for example. This is where the journalist would start, or this is where, I guess, a typical news story, as you would call it, would start. So the first paragraph is what journalists would call the lead. And this paragraph is about 30 words long, so it's only one or two sort of very thin paragraphs, and it gives you all the information you need. The essential elements of the story are in that first paragraph. So you have your who, your what, your where, your when, your why, your how. You could read that first paragraph or first two paragraphs essentially, and then stop reading the story and you'd understand what the story was about. Why do journalists write like that? That's because that structure enables readers to stop reading at any point in the story as they go through sort of the specific finding, they come through the argument, the evidence, some of the background details, and they get all the extra related items at the end. that enables them to stop reading at any point of the story and still come away with the essence, because that essence is in the first 2 paragraphs. And the reason that that's important is because people are so time poor right now. Well, they always have been, but with sort of attention spans online being around 5 seconds, you don't have a very long time to hook someone in to read your 800, 600, 400 word story. You really need to hook them in at that very beginning stage. If you have a very rambly, long-winded introduction and you only get to the core part of your message in the sort of 4th paragraph, 5th paragraph, buried down, people may not struggle through that to really find out what it is. And it'd be a shame if they didn't, I guess, get the key message you were trying to find. So that hook is really important. Now, whether you choose to go for a news style structure or some other kind of structure we'll talk about later, that doesn't matter. But I think keeping in mind, you want really to hook people in straight away. And it also, I guess, this structure allows people to explore a topic to only the depth that their curiosity takes them, but they can still, but if you're an interested reader, you can still make that information available to them if they want to keep reading. So you kind of cater for interested readers and people who are just wanting to get the kind of essence of the information and leave. So an example of a hard news style lead, the one that was just in that inverted pyramid paragraph. Sorry, there's a bit of technical issues, so I can't, I guess, animate this so you don't see the bottom bit, so bear with me with that. So an example of a hard news style paragraph at the top, you've got a really sort of a rhetorical question as your title. It's really striking. Multi-million always gets sort of people interested. And then that first paragraph tells everyone everything they need to know. What the main finding of a new analysis is, that, you know, forest certification is going to improve forest management, but there's, you know, a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be done. So that's what we would call a hard news style lead, that then goes through into a more, I guess, general rest of the story. Another style of writing is feature style, which is much more of a narrative style of writing. And they're often stories that are told through the characters, using anecdotes to help illustrate events. And they often use much more colourful language than news stories. They're a lot more playful, and they usually engage the reader more than perhaps the traditional news story does, because there's a more human element in there. Here you can see an example. This is research that was being done in Cameroon on a climbing plant that had some interesting, I guess, cures that it could. And so we decided to start that story from the perspective of the villagers in that area who were using that forest food, and then talking about the research after that. So I wanted to just compare and contrast quickly how academics write versus how science bloggers write. Academics often start with a long and descriptive title in their research papers, for good reason, but still it's very long-winded. The abstract is the next part of the scientific paper, which is kind of a summary of the paper. You then move into an introduction, which is quite long, very detailed methods, results, discussion, conclusion, references. We're all pretty familiar with that, I'm sure. At no point usually during those research papers are personal pronouns used. You wouldn't say I did this or we did that or my research says. That's a very interesting, and I think other debate we could have around sort of passive structure. There's some really interesting stuff being written by Steve Pinker on that sort of style of academic writing, and actually says it stinks, but you can read about that yourself. Whereas science bloggers normally have a short, snappy title that hooks the reader in. Typically in a news structure, there's the main finding or an anecdote in a more narrative style at the top, which is called that lead paragraph, and keeping that pretty short. The next thing that normally there is very straight up, which normally would come in discussion part of a research paper, is this idea of why is it significant. That's really important to have high up in the science blog, because it kind of makes readers want to read more. We understand why it's important now. You've told us what you found. You've told us why it's important. Okay, now I'm willing to go with you on the ride and read more about the science. So that why is it important or significant point is really crucial. Often in a news style story, this would be in a quote from the lead researcher. So the researcher has said, you know, this is revolutionizing this space, blah, blah, blah. And that works well as a quote normally. You then, after you've set up that finding and the significance of that finding, you then move into sort of, I guess, the introduction, the methods, very briefly, the main results or explanation of those results and why those are significant and what that means more broadly. You then may discuss a bit more and then finish with a what's next. So it's a very sort of different structure, as you can see, to the academic paper. Another thing to note is references. Obviously, in an academic paper, those are all at the end that are sort of footnoted, perhaps, or throughout the academic paper. Preferably in science blogging, hyperlinking references is the way I think is the best way to do it. I'll talk a bit more about that in the nuts and bolts part of the webinar. I'm not going to go through this in detail because we don't have enough time, but I've included these slides in the slides to be presented at this, the slides that you'll get at the end of the webinar, where you can sort of, I've compared and contrasted a paper with the way it's been blogged. So I just wanted to show you the way that the title and the paragraph compared. So as you can see, the title of the academic paper is quite full of jargon and sort of really kind of hard to understand, whereas the blog title for that paper is very, short, snappy, and kind of interesting context. And the lead paragraph of I guess the main finding of the paper, is very, again, jargony, and you can see that the lead paragraph and the first quote of the science blog really come in and hit the nail on the head, setting up the context that, money doesn't buy, we always think that money matters more to people, but actually that's an outdated concept. So have a peruse through that after the webinar and see how, the academic paper compares to the way the science blog has been written. All right, moving into some tips for blogging. These are my do's and don'ts. Do, as I've mentioned, tell a story when you're writing a blog. Bring in your personal experience, write conversationally. Blogs are human. Be human, show the human side of science. It's scary sometimes, but your reader will really appreciate understanding, I guess the story from a human perspective, and it'll resonate with people. So, write your stories if you're telling a friend over coffee. Source facts and figures. Now, so I referred to this a bit earlier, but this is crucial, and it's something we can't talk about enough and we kind of forget about. If you mention a fact, hyperlink to a credible source. Nowhere is this more important in science blogging, which is meant to be evidence-based and fact-based. And preferably that source is a research paper or a fact sheet or a database or a credible institution that has that stat. What it also does, not just from protecting you, so if someone comes and says that's not the right stat, you can say, well, actually I've hyperlinked to a source that says that. What it does is it allows the reader to go deeper. If they want to know more about a specific paper you've referenced or a stat you've referenced, they can by clicking on the link and reading about it. So give them that pathway if they want to learn more. It also allows them to make connections between different bits and pieces. So you might be pulling together a whole bunch of different findings into a story to talk about a specific area of science. And by connecting to those papers or to those different facts, you're allowing a reader to make connections between different bits of data. And I think from a philosophical perspective, that's really important that we increase that. And hopefully that increases the science literacy of people by being able to read and digest those bits of information. At the end of the story, you can suggest related reading. So you may have a couple of papers that you want, if people want to read more, they can. And that's fine. I wouldn't footnote. I personally don't like footnotes. I find them too academic. I think just hyperlinking the text where you're mentioning something, as you can see in this example, where we've referenced the Forest Stewardship Council, or we've talked about a paper or a survey. We've just linked in that part so people can read when they want there. You can also automate related reading. That's something we don't have time to go into, but you can create algorithms. We did at C4 based on the keywords of your research publications that can automatically generate when you've kind of, I guess, tag a blog story with those keywords. If you're interested in that, you can write or tweet to me and I can give you some more information about that. Don't overdo it. One hyperlink every few paragraphs is enough. It can make it really hard to read if you've got 7 hyperlinks in a paragraph. So just be mindful of that. The next tip that I wanted to talk about is images. Increasingly, social media is becoming a visual medium. This is an interesting conversation as to whether, how text is, how blogs and text, I think they were, over the last 3 years, the most important part of social media. Now I think it's all about the visuals, actually. So using striking and unusual images to accompany your blog stories is incredibly important. So when you're choosing your images, shallow depth of field, not grainy, bright colors, pictures, bright colors is great. Photos from a conference aren't really that interesting, so don't use them, don't overdo them. Here are some great images. I really like cartoons. I think that especially for abstract topics like governance and things that are hard to illustrate, cartoons, maybe more satirical things can be really a great way to make it a bit different and interesting. Great number of repositories out there for you to find images, and if you search for images with Creative Commons licenses, they're all free. So there's a whole bunch of really great free images that you can find to accompany your stories. Spend time on it, value its importance. Isn't nothing worse than writing a great story and then not making it visually interesting with a good supporting image. Keep your paragraphs short. There's science to prove why that's important. Eye-tracking studies that have been done show that online readers skip large blocks of text. We don't like it. We want short, sharp text. There's a nice rule, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rule. Make sure your paragraph contains one idea expressed in 2 to 3 short sentences, taking 4 to 5 lines on a page. Often people ask me about word count. How long should the story be? I guess have maybe a more controversial approach to that, is that I think it really depends on how much the story needs. If it's a short story, it's really a newsy story about one research finding, and you don't analyze it that much. If you can do it in 300 words, great, be concise. If it needs longer, then give it a bit longer. I think it's really more important that I think the word count is a bit of a relic from newspaper articles where they had to fit things into sort of certain spaces. We have the, I guess, luxury with online publishing that you can obviously go as long as you like, but keep in mind, I would recommend not going over 800 words normally. That's a nice limit for most science blogs, unless you're doing a really sort of deep investigative piece or a feature story perhaps. But if you are, I would even suggest splitting that into several different stories. So you could have sort of a series that are, 4 800 word pieces. Use proper spelling, punctuation and grammar. Just because it's a blog doesn't mean that you can kind of be sloppy. So if you can get someone to proofread your blog before you publish it, I think that's just really important. Coming back again to knowing your audience, this is very important. And as we've spoken about before, don't underestimate the value of knowing your audience. If you're running even if you're writing a narrative piece or maybe a personal opinion piece, using quotes can be a really great way to break up sort of, I guess, text that you've written. So I would use quotes to break up your story and put a bit of a voice in there. But if you do use quotes, make sure you get them right. So some frequently asked questions when interviewing scientists, what kind of quotes are you looking for in a story? I would normally say you're looking for the importance or significance kind of quote. And this is normally, if you can also quote papers, if you're writing about a paper, you could say the authors said. It's not as nice normally as a punchy quote, because when we write, it's not really how you would express verbally. And you can often find those types of quotes in the discussion part of a paper. But that's the kind of quote you want, a punchy, short, sharp, amazing, important, significant quote. So what happens if in the paper they don't mention why it's significant or important, or when you're at a presentation by a scientist that they don't touch on that or really say that verbally? I would say call them and ask them for that kind of quote. Or if you're at a conference, you could ask them in the question time or after their presentation. And if you're blogging from a conference, which we'll talk about in the next webinar, feel free to ask presenters for an interview during lunchtime if you need more information from their presentation. So don't be shy, ask people to tell you that so you can use it in your story. The next question is, what happens if they use a lot of jargon when they respond to you? Because obviously jargon in a story is the antithesis of what you're going for. You can always paraphrase or edit their quote. So you can see an example here where there's an example of a quote that maybe someone had said that wasn't so straightforward. You can kind of put things in square brackets to add words in that weren't said. You can use the sort of ellipses, the 3 dots, to kind of link 2 separate, if you want to edit out of a sentence and then join 2 sentences together. You can mash up that quote to make it a bit more punchy. But if you are being interviewed, think about that, that people need to I guess, get something short and sharp and snappy for their stories. I just wanted to sort of make a point here that the world's most banal science quote is, "This research is interesting, but more work needs to be done. You will not believe the number of times I've seen that in stories." Of course, more work needs to be done. That's kind of the point of science. But be more specific. Don't kind of play to that idea. What research needs to be done? What experiments could be done? What might have that impact that might have? Be specific about that. Don't let people sort of, I guess, come with that "more work needs to be done" phrase. It's overused, and I think it's a boring. It's kind of a lazy way to quote in a story. Some don'ts. If you're blogging from a conference, don't document the event unless you're writing a report. But blog is not a report. This is an example of a blog where, it's just very procedural. This title and lead paragraph are boring, are full of jargon. They're not not something you'd want to read about. So avoid documenting. Find the key research that's being presented at the event and write about that, or write about something a bit more human. Don't document in a blog. Don't use jargon or acronyms. I think that goes without saying. People, especially if you're trying to target a broad, educated but not technical audience, they don't understand jargon from your technical field. They don't know your acronyms. Be mindful of that, because sometimes you can forget that and use acronyms without realizing you're using them. So just after you've written something, get someone else to read it, or go over it with a fine-tooth comb yourself. Make sure you're not doing that. The passive voice is the bane of a lot of communicators. I guess it is counterproductive to a good active character-filled story. So just if you don't know what active and passive are, active voice is where the action precedes the subject. So the 2 examples here: an active voice, "Wild penguins attacked my sister," whereas something like that sentence written in a passive voice was, "My sister was attacked by wild penguins." So you don't really, let me give you an example here with a science example. Academic writing uses passive voice a lot because we want the readers to focus on the result rather than the person. And that has a place in academic writing. But what it does with storytelling is it makes it really difficult to find out who the characters in the story are. And when we come back to the principles of storytelling, that's what makes a good story. So here's an example here of, just the difference in being able to comprehend this sentence by just adding "researchers have done," rather than sort of, I guess, just saying what the cause of death is. Be mindful of using passive voice, and really, where you can, try to refrain from doing it. It is harder to read often. Don't write boring and long headlines. Obviously, this is your main way of getting someone to read your story. That is the main way you can hook them in. Make sure a headline is not boring and long. Here are some great examples of things that can sort of, I guess, encourage you to think about new ways of writing headlines. You can, think of a surprise type of headline. You could ask a question in your headline. You could find a curiosity gap, where you say, "There's 10 things, number 9 is impossible." That one's a bit more of a BuzzFeed style headline, and I would use it sparingly because it can be a little bit clickbait, which means people click on it and the story actually isn't that great, and it's been set up to be great by the title. Negatives, how-tos are great. People really like those. Numbers work really well, so 10 tips, or 10 new research findings in biodiversity, that sort of thing works really well with audiences. Reference your audience. So this is, for people on the verge of writing the perfect blog post, this is the story for you. People sort of identify with that. And then being very specific can often be good. Sometimes it can be overboard, but it can be good. So how do you let people know about your stories once you've published them? This is where I think it's important to recognize that blogs sit within a plethora of different social media channels. This is a graphic we developed at C4 to sort of make sense of where the blog fit as part of the different social media channels. As you can see here, Forest News is the blog. And we saw there's I guess a connection between the teasers, which is sort of Facebook, Twitter, your micro blogs, things that are short, snappy, and aiming to hook people in to read more. The blog provides that read more part. So you hook them in with a really interesting tweet, they read your blog, they might click on the links in your blog and read the key science. Everything is, I guess, from the perspective of a strategical institutional perspective, everything comes back to your key content, your research findings, your papers. That is what we want people really to read or to be aware of. So when you're writing stories, you have to engage people. And so I would recommend, if you are going to set up a personal blog, have a Twitter channel that you can use as a way to promote those blog stories and let people in the wider world know what's happening on what you're publishing. You can use those channels to get new readers, and you can also follow your readership using those tools. You won't get readers just by publishing stories. You have to, I guess, go out there and publicize them with different social media channels, and make sure you're always thinking about this kind of connection between the channels, the Twitter channel leading to the blog, which leads to the research. But I think something to note here is that you can spend a lot of time on thinking about this, and that's, comm stuff, that's something that they do. But I think the best way to grow an audience is to produce excellent content and let that content speak for itself. Obviously, you have to let people know it's there, but don't spend your whole time trying to market and not focus on producing the good quality content, because content is king. So if you've got good science blog stories, people will come and they will read them once they start to know that it's, that they're around. So don't ever compromise the quality of your content because you are focused on publicizing it. So in summary, stories connect people, and science is full of fantastic, dramatic, wonderful, controversial stories. So you can, and hopefully I've given you some tips on where to find those. Blogs can significantly increase your readership of your scientific papers, and that's one of the key reasons I think scientists need to think about dedicating time to blog stories as much as they think about dedicating time to writing and doing science. And you must grab the reader, the very busy reader, with your headline, your image, and your first paragraph. Make sure those are bang on, sharp, and really hook in a reader. A whole bunch of resources I will be sending to you guys via email, so don't worry about this, you will get all that. There's a lot of stuff out there on how to write blogs. Peruse that, tweet about it, let me know what you think about it. If there's more, hopefully you've been sharing that through the chat box today. So let's start blog writing. We're doing something really exciting at Future Earth, and we're offering you the opportunity to submit a story to us and get personalized feedback. So between now and September 30, where we'll be having another webinar as a follow-up for this one, the first 30 of you to submit a blog story to the email address here, owengaffney@futureearth.org, will receive personalized feedback. So we'll have a look at your story, we'll provide you with some editing guidance, things you could think about doing better, etc. The stories you submit should be based on science and sustainability, and they could be any of those things I mentioned: new research findings you've had, latest developments in your field, or in how what you're working on relates to some stuff happening out in the world. Features from field work, though these may take a little, if you haven't got those already, they may take some time to find. You obviously have to go to the field, or things from your lab. Interesting conferences you've been to, or a particular session that was interesting, or perhaps you presented something and you want to write a story about it. We'll be publishing a bunch of those hopefully on the Future Earth blog in the coming weeks. So take advantage of that opportunity to get that feedback from myself, from Owen, and from the rest of the Future Earth team. And then on the 30th of September, we'll be having another webinar at the same time, 11 a.m. CET, where we'll review some of those submitted blog stories, mainly to pull out some of the, I guess, the things that, seem to be common amongst people, what they may have done that could be improved. We'll discuss some lessons that, that we learned through doing that exercise, what people hopefully learn from that. And we'll also be talking about how to live blog from a conference, which is probably the first if you haven't blogged before, it may be the first time that you actually start blogging, and it's a great way to start blogging. So make sure you sign up to that. The link that is there in the, and we'll be sending that around by email as well. That's all I've got for you today, but I'd love to hear some questions that you have. So I'll throw to Owen now. Owen, maybe you can let me know if there's been any questions on the chat box.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. That was absolutely fantastic. You can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah, that was absolutely brilliant. Really concise and clear. So I'm sure people really enjoyed that. So we have just a few questions in here, actually. One, Amy Green asks about this C4 link on blogging. Have we got the link there? But you've probably got it in the slide. That lists all the links that you've just shown. But if you could put that in the chat box, that would be good. Tom Gill talks about personal pronouns and says that quite a few journals now accept writing in that more personal style, which is great, because you read in journals all the time, it is thought that, and you never find out who's doing the thinking there. Is it the writer? Is it the sort of wider research community? Yeah, so Benjamin Casper mentioned something on Paperly, paper.li, as a web tool for collaborative blog and social media. I don't know it, actually. Do you know that, Michelle?
Yeah, so we've used Paperly to compile. So Paperly is basically an online newspaper that collates stories from around the web on different keywords you put in and creates like a newspaper essentially and sends it out or tweets it. As far as I'm aware, you can't actually write on Paperly. You can publish stories on a blogging platform and then just make sure that they're collated into a Paperly paper on the topic. It's a great little tool, and you can customize it, and it's a great way to, I guess, if you're preparing for a conference and you want to sort of collate the content about that conference, you can set that all up, automate it, it'll tweet out every week with that relevant content, and it's good to go. So it's a great tool for that. It's not a blogging platform though. You don't write on Paperly. You can write on other platforms like Medium, for example, and a couple of the other collaborative blogging platforms that I mentioned.
Great. And I'm going to have to go in a second because I'm giving a talk in about 3 minutes' time in another room here. But I would like to share this. I don't know if it's on your list as another resource, Language Intelligence by Joe Romm. Joe Romm is a blogger for climate progress and possibly the leading blogger in the US. He's got a huge following. And he's written a fantastic book about using rhetorics and other devices, lessons on persuasion from Jesus, Shakespeare, Lincoln, and Lady Gaga. It's absolutely a great book, and I'd like to encourage everybody on to send in some blogs for the Future Earth website, and really looking forward to that. And we really want to put together, this big picture of global sustainability research and the solutions, and get these out to the world, engaging a new audience. So thank you very much, and I'm going to have to run.
Thanks, Owen, and thanks everybody. We'll be, as I mentioned, emailing you all with the links to the slides that we presented today, the video from today, and also an evaluation survey. So if you could fill that in, that would be fantastic. I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar and found it useful. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to tweet at me at kovamic, K-O-V-A-M-I-C. I'd be happy to answer any further questions you have. Otherwise, we hope to see you at the next webinar in 2 weeks' time, which will be on following up from this, reviewing some common blogging mistakes and talking about how to live blog from a conference. Thank you and have a good day.